Good morning. Have your Bibles handy. I don't have any idea where I'm going to read from first, but we're going to read a little bit this morning. We're continuing, of course, our study on the genealogy of Jesus, looking at those who are listed in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, noting some importances or significance about them, and kind of following God's plan here throughout time to the coming of Christ. We get, and we've talked about, especially with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and actually a little bit of Judah also, where God is constantly putting these clues down about here's something that is to come, some descendant of, this line is going to bring about something great. And we see that in various forms and various ways. And I guess you don't really think about it until you see it over and over and over again in a study like this. So I think this has been really good for us so far. Last week we talked about Judah. I kind of wrapped up everything I wanted to say about Judah for the most part. I guess there are some more things that could be said if anyone wants to stop me and say, hey, wait, what about this? Okay, no, we'll move on then. So we're going to move on. We're going to talk about Perez. Actually, we'll probably get through several today. When I was thinking, before I was really sitting down preparing my notes, I'm thinking, well, Perez till about David, there's not really much going on as far as details about anyone in that line, except really for Boaz. We should get through this pretty quick. And then as you kind of cycle through some of these bits and pieces here and there, you're like, no, there's a story here we can put together. So I actually have more to say about a lot of these individuals than I thought I would. But hopefully it'll be good for us. Of course, the next one's Perez, is listed in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3, and Luke chapter 3, verse 33. Perez, we've kind of talked about him a little bit when we talked about Judah. Perez is mentioned first in pretty much his most well-known appearances, is when he's born, being the son of Judah and Tamar, as seen in Genesis 38. And we went through a lot of Genesis 38 last time, so I'm not going to rehash all of it, but one detail I want to note again is Perez is the younger of the twins that was born from Judah and Tamar. So he's actually technically the second born by hand's length, very technically. So that's where we have his first mention. And he himself, Perez, is not really mentioned as doing anything really notable aside from that or doing anything great. We do get a lot of him being mentioned in the Old Testament in lineages, mentions of his descendants specifically tying themselves to Perez. Genesis 46, verse 12, Numbers chapter 26, verses 20 and 21, Ruth chapter 4, verse 12 and 18, which we'll come back to that section of verses in Ruth when we talk about Boaz, because I think it's actually a really interesting tie between Perez and Boaz here in that story. But because I want to focus on the context of that, I'll wait till we get to Boaz to talk a little bit more about that. We also see Perez mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 9, verse 4, chapter 27, verse 3, and also in the book of Nehemiah chapter 11, verses 4 and 6, which Nehemiah, that's important because they need to be saying like, okay, who is actually the descendants of Israel here? These people that are mentioned in Nehemiah were able to tie themselves back to Perez. So they had a link there that they were able to go back with. So a very interesting detail there, way past his lifetime. Now there are also, if you're doing like a simple name concordance, you're going to encounter a lot of cities with the name Perez in it. Because a lot of cities, they'd have two names. So you'd have Perez such and such. There are several of those included. We know that Perez had two sons, Hezron and Hamul. We see that mentioned in Genesis 46, verse 12. Numbers chapter 26, verses 21, and 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 5. And just to note, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, we're going to go back there a couple times for a lot of these. 1 Chronicles chapter 2 gives a lot of additional detail on these lineages that we wouldn't have otherwise. So I'll probably be referencing there a bit. We'll probably read some sections of that later this morning. But as far as that goes, that's all I really have to say about Perez. Again, he doesn't really have anything very notable about himself that he did in his lifetime, but he is, again, one of these key figures in this lineage that he comes up again and again and again, but we don't really know much about him except really the circumstances of his birth. That's the most detail we get about him. We don't get an entire chapter devoted to him, for instance, as we had with Judah. So it's really just bits and pieces with Perez. Comments, questions, thoughts about Perez, his birth, anything else that I've kind of mentioned? Okay, I'm going to move on then. Let's talk about the next one in the lineage. That's Hezron, as we see in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3, and Luke chapter 3, verse 33. We know that Hezron was the son of Perez, but this can get a little confusing because Reuben, which would be Hezron's great uncle, Reuben also had a son and named him Hezron. So there are multiple Hezrons kind of living around the same time period, and they're in the same genealogical paragraphs. You'll have more than one Hezron there, so just be careful when you're going through that. Because you say well, wait a minute, Hezron is the son of Reuben? That's not right. It's a different Hezron. Not to be confusing, but this is the thing that comes up. We've seen this before. Different guy. That Hezron shows up in Genesis 46, verse 9, and Exodus chapter 6, verse 14, and also 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 3. So that can be a little confusing. Son of Reuben. There's also some Israelite towns with the name Hezron in them, so you might encounter that as well. Don't be too thrown off by that. But what I want to talk about most is the sons of Hezron, because this is probably the most detail we have about his life, and it's also the most confusing. So Hezron, his descendants are listed for us in a very detailed way in 1 Chronicles chapter 2. Here comes 1 Chronicles chapter 2 coming up again. As I mentioned, we're going to kind of reference that quite a bit. Now it states there in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 9 that Hezron had 3 sons. That's Jeremiel, Ram, and Caleb. Now the name Caleb may sound familiar to you. You're like, oh yeah, Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies that went into the land, the only 2 that had the good report, the only 2 that came out of Egypt and went into the promised land. The entire the generation with them had died off, and only those 2 made it. Well, it's not that Caleb. This is a different Caleb than that Caleb. That Caleb that we know of, that's paired with Joshua to give that good report, that's Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. Different Caleb. So don't get thrown off by that. This is a different person, just happens to have the same name. So as I said, Hezron had 3 sons, Jeremiel, Ram, and Caleb, but not that Caleb that we all know. But later, when you go to 1 Chronicles, I think it's verse 21, chapter 2, verse 21, it says that when Hezron was 60 years old, he marries the daughter of Machir and has another son named Segub, I think is that's how I'm going to pronounce it anyway. And then later in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 24, it seems that shortly after he dies, Hezron's wife Abijah gives birth to Ashur. So I guess she was pregnant before he died, and then after he dies, she gives birth to their son. Now Ashur is the father of Tekoa, which that might be a name. You're like, Tekoa, I've heard that somewhere. That's the town or village where the prophet Amos comes from. We're told in the book of Amos he was from Tekoa. So an interesting connection there that I can't imagine that place has that name, just happens to be that name. I'm sure it's named after that Tekoa. That's my guess anyway. So very interesting tie there. So when it says in 1 Chronicles chapter 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 9, where it says that Hezron had 3 sons, he actually has 5 by the time we add them all up, because he had a son later in life and then a son born after he had died, shortly after he had died, I guess. So that's not an unheard of thing that's happened before in human history. It's just this kind of weird thing that went on. So he actually has 5 sons descended from him. The one we're going to follow is Ram, the second born, but it's just one of these interesting details about Hezron that you don't see very often about others. So there's really not much else about Hezron aside from those details. So I'm going to move on to Ram, unless there's any thoughts, comments, questions about any of that. Okay. I'm going to move on to Ram. There's actually not that much to talk about with Ram. We see him in Matthew chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, and also Luke chapter 3, verse 33. As I mentioned before, Ram is the second born son of Hezron, and Ram would go on to be the father of Abinadab. We see that, or Aminadab, sorry, I may have pronounced that incorrectly. Aminadab That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Again, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, I'm going to mention quite a bit as we go through here. The only other thing I want to note about Ram, I don't really have much else to say about him, but just a clarification, because we have people naming people the same names. Ram's older brother, Jeremiel, who we just mentioned not that long ago, also has a son and names him Ram. So Ram has a nephew named Ram. So and they're right there in like the same couple paragraphs of the genealogy. So you're like, wait, I thought Ram was the son of Hezron. Yeah, it's a different Ram, the grandson of Hezron, but not Ram the son of Ram. It's Ram the son of Jeremiel. They weren't very creative with the names. Like everybody named their kids John and Mary and all that. It happens. So just in case you're doing a concordance search and you see all these other Rams, different Ram. But anyway, that's all I have to say about Ram. I don't have anything else. Any comments, questions on that? All right, let's talk about Amminadab. This one, I think, is probably one of the most interesting. We see him mentioned in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew chapter 1, verse 4, and Luke chapter 3, verse 33. Now, kind of just like the others we've been talking about, Amminadab is mentioned in several lineages and several spots. I'm not going to go to all of them or reference all of them again. But he's most famous for being the father of Nahshon. That's like his claim to fame. Like 90% of the mentions of Amminadab it was Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. That's what he seems to be most known for, is being the father of Nahshon. Now, Nahshon, we're going to talk about him in just a second, but he plays kind of an important role in Israel's history, and we'll talk about that. We'll get to it this morning. So we'll get to that when we get to it. But I think another really interesting detail, and I had not remembered this until I was doing my notes. Amminadab, a descendant of Judah, becomes the father-in-law to Aaron the high priest. And you're all like, wait a minute, how does that work? So when you go to Exodus chapter 6, verse 23, and I'll sort of read the first part as it's written. It says that Aaron married Elisheba, daughter of Amminadab and sister of Nahshon. So we know that's the right Amminadab. And she bore him Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. So those names should all be interesting. So here we have the tribe of Levi, of course, Aaron would be of the tribe of Levi, and we have the tribe of Judah, and the daughter of Amminadab is marrying the high priest of Levi. Now, that line is not going to be the one that goes down to Christ. We're going to follow his son Nahshon, not his daughter. But that's an interesting connection there that I had not remembered. It's just this detail that is put there, and then it's never mentioned again. It's just here in Exodus chapter 6, verse 23. So a very interesting detail. Now, if you're going to ask me what's the spiritual significance of that, I don't really have much else to say except for it's very interesting. And you have a very interesting tie with the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Levi there with Aaron the high priest. Of all people, the Aaron, the high priest. So interesting. And this has sort of a ripple effect because the name Amminadab comes up more than once. Those of you who kind of look down in the history, this becomes sort of a popular name in the tribe of Levi later on. If you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 22, 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 11, we have these priests named Amminadab that are mentioned, but they're of the tribe of Levi. But we don't see that name in the tribe of Levi before that, as far as I know. So it may be that these Amminadabs who became Levitical priests later on in history were named after this descendant of Judah, who was technically an ancestor of theirs because he became the father-in-law of Aaron, which is really interesting. Thoughts, comments on that? That's really all I have to say about him. That's like the most interesting thing, and it's mentioned there, and then that's it, and then we move on. So, go ahead, Jeff. Yeah, like and I can't remember. I'd have to look that up. I know it comes up more than once.
He was beside Uzzah when they were leading the ark back. When Uzzah reached up and touched the ark and died.
That may be. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Leading that procession, but that is a common name among the priests.
Yeah, and there's also some variants to him. You have Amminadab, you have I think there's different spellings or similar variant names to that. So there's probably more than just the one that's spelled exactly the way you have it in your Bible. We get that with like the name Joshua, Jeshua, Jesus. Those are all variants of the same name. So it comes up multiple times. It's just one of those interesting things. That makes sense now. Now that, oh yeah, he was the father-in-law of Aaron. No wonder this name keeps coming up. They're giving some honor to that ancestor. But that ancestor is of the tribe of Judah, not of Levi. So interesting stuff. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Go ahead. Yeah, I know what you're saying. I don't think I could say that with any certainty because I'm sure there's a lot of exceptions to that sort of trend. The real reason, and it's probably some of the reason we do it today, we like to name our descendants because of people we knew that we want to pay honor to, or and we see this a lot. How many times do we name our children after our grandparents or an uncle or someone who was very dear to us, a good friend? I think that's probably more the reason. I can't say no to what you're saying, but also I can't really confirm it. That'd be another rabbit hole I'd have to go down. But this is a naming convention we see as early as pre-flood era. I mean, before the flood, people are naming multiple people Enoch. I mean, we have more than one Enoch, and we always think, oh, but there's that one Enoch. Yeah, but there's others too. They're just not very creative with names. that would be my thing. But also, I think it's more the idea of they're paying some tribute or some honor to someone that they really appreciated or they thought was very important, and you have that naming convention. That makes the most sense to me. I mean, there may be something I don't know. If you want to go ahead and study that for us, and next week come back with a report, I'd love to hear more on that because that's an interesting thought. I haven't gone down that rabbit hole, as I've said, but I'd be interested in looking more at that if you would do that for me. Just delegate this out. Very good. Any other thoughts on Aminadab?
We are actually very creative. I have a nephew named Jeff, and so we have a little Jeff and a big Jeff.
No. And that's how it's written on the birth certificate too? I mean, they do similar things like that. We had, Cain, and then later on you got Tubal Cain, little Cain. I don't think that's what the name means, but I mean, we see stuff like that. That's a common thing. All right, if nothing else, I'm going to move on to Nahshon. We see him listed in the lineage in Matthew chapter 1, verse 4, and also Luke chapter 3, verse 32. And I mentioned this before, Aminadab is best known for being the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon is really important. He doesn't get listed a whole bunch of times. He's pretty kind of tied to his time period, but his role in his own time period is very important. And this is his role regarding the Exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. He is, and we'll read from this. Go ahead and turn to Numbers chapter 1, because I want somebody to read from this, but I'll give kind of a quick setup here. When the 12 tribes of Israel leave Egypt, each tribe is given a designated leader for that tribe. And Nahshon is the one who is leader for the tribe of Judah during this time as they're leaving Egypt, heading toward the Promised Land. Someone read for us Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. And there'd be more coming after it, but 1 through 7 should be sufficient. Numbers 1, 1 through 7, please.
The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the Sheluah, son of, well, here's a good one, Zurishaddai, and from Judah, Nashon, son of Amminadab.
All right, thank you. And then you keep going through the tribes. I'll keep listing the rest of them. But this is Nashon, the son of Amminadab, is the one we're interested in. So as you see here, and a lot of this time period while they're in the desert, we see organization of the nation. We're organizing by tribes. We're organizing where the encampments are supposed to be, what the laws and regulations are for the people. And this is one of these things. And one representative from each tribe is supposed to be helping Moses directly. And of all the people from the tribe of Judah, it's Nashon, the son of Amminadab, which you'd say, like, well, maybe there's a conflict of interest here because Moses is the brother of Aaron, and Aaron would technically be the brother-in-law to Nashon. So, but yeah, I would say it's a small world. They're all related. It would all be a conflict of interest. This is not nepotism as we would think of it today. But it's interesting that this man who is in the lineage of Jesus, he's not called a king, but he is the leader of the tribe of Judah, reporting to Moses as they are supposed to be in the wilderness heading up to the promised land. Now, that's not the only time that this is mentioned. He also gets mentioned in Numbers chapter 2, verse 3, and chapter 10, verse 14. And then we actually get turn over to Numbers chapter 7. I'll have someone read from there in just a second. Numbers chapter 7. We see an offering that Nashon brings to the altar before the Lord. Each one of the tribes is supposed to do this every day, and we'll read that in a little bit. But he is the first one to give his sacrifice. So you'd think, well, wouldn't it go in birth order? Shouldn't the one from Reuben do it first? I mean, it was the one first listed here in Numbers chapter 1. But no, Nashon from the tribe of Judah is the first to give the sacrifice to the altar when it's been anointed or cleansed. I forget the term that's used. But let's turn there. Let's just read it. Someone read for us Numbers chapter 7, verses 10 through 17, please. 7, 10 through 17.
Now the leaders offered the dedication offering for the altar when it was anointed. So the leaders offered their offering before the altar. For the Lord said to Moses, they shall offer their offering 1 liter each day for the dedication of the offering. And the one who offered his offering on the first day was Nashon, the son of Amminadab, from the tribe of Judah. His offering was 1 silver platter, the weight of which was 130 shekels, and 1 silver bowl of 70 shekels, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, both of them full of fine flour mixed with oil as a grain offering. 1 pan of gold of 10 shekels, full of incense. 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 1 male lamb in its first year as a burnt offering. 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering, and for the sacrifice of peace offerings, 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 male goats, and 5 male lambs in their first year. This was the offering of Nashon, the son of Amminadab.
All right, thank you. So this seems like, just an interesting detail, but there's something to it. He's the first one to go offer the sacrifice. Now, why is Judah the first here? There's, again, not the firstborn tribes, not the one that was mentioned first in Numbers chapter 1, but for whatever reason, Nashon is the first one to give his offering. Now, is that because he was the first one to get organized, or was he the one who was the most motivated and wanted to make sure he got it to the Lord as soon as possible? We're not told these details, but there may be something to it. I just think it's a really interesting detail. He's obviously, he's playing an important role here, even though he's not really going to be, this bigger, larger than life character with all these stories about him. But we get these little details about him, and there absolutely has to be a lot of work that he was doing that we just don't have recorded. Just given, the position he was given, some of the details we see about him, he certainly was playing an important role as the children of Israel were traveling from Egypt to the Promised Land. So I think that's a really interesting thing to see about this guy who I didn't even remember much about as I'm going through the genealogy here. He's actually kind of important. Comments, thoughts, questions? Jeff and then Gretchen.
He was, Judah was the acting firstborn. Can I say that?
We've kind of said that, things to that nature. Because Issachar is second, and I don't really have an explanation for that either.
It is an interesting thing that Judah was, because Judah was acting, this makes more sense than the other action.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on like how we want to think should be priority or how we'd want to organize it. And it may just been that the other tribes just hadn't gotten their act together, and just he was ready to go. He was the best organized. We don't know for sure. It's a detail we can surmise about, we can make thoughts about, but we don't really know for sure. But it's definitely notable. So that's why I bring it up, because I mean, this sacrifice is not some little thing. He's got multiple pairs of livestock. He's got gold and silver and incense and all these things, and he has them ready to go on the first day. Now, I imagine, did they get much heads up about, hey, you need to bring this? Or maybe he just always had something like this ready to go. We don't know. I'm going beyond what the Bible says, so I'm not going to say definitively how that came to be, but we know it came to be. So that's as far as I'll say about it. Gretchen, I think you had a comment. Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to wander.
Well, they were in the desert for 40 years.
Right.
So
Obviously had to been places they set up and stayed for a while.
yeah, and they did, and also in Numbers, going back to Numbers chapter 1, where we just read, when he's first mentioned there, that first verse says, it was after they came out of Egypt, the first day of the second month of the second year. So it's already been a couple years by the time Nahshon is taking this role as the leader of the tribe of Judah. Now, I don't know exactly when chapter 7 takes place, but it's going to be after that, most likely. Otherwise, he wouldn't be making that sacrifice. How many years, how many months, how many days exactly, I can't say. What I can say is they haven't gotten to the promised land yet. Moses hasn't died yet. I would guess a handful of years, perhaps. I can't say definitively what year.
Yeah, I just look at this and go, okay, well, they're still eating the manna, and what are they feeding the goats, and how did they get the gold? And I mean, did they really come across the Red Sea with all these animals? And you know what I mean? It's just, they must have been doing some trading.
Well, we know they plundered Egypt when they left it, because basically what happened is the Egyptians, so eager to have them get out of there, said, just take our stuff and leave. And that's where a lot of the material, as far as we understand, came from. Because a lot of that stuff, you can't get it in the desert. And there's not a lot of large civilizations out there. You might have passing caravans here and there. But large majority of it came from Egypt.
Still, I just like to kind of really feel like being there, and I'm going, okay, well, maybe I was watching that History Channel, I think, the Bible last night, and and it's real exciting because they're real close to getting them before they cross, and you're going, I don't think you'd be taking all these, and he's just one guy, all these herds and everything, so maybe they weren't quite as close as Hollywood wants to be.
Well, as far as the crossing of the Red Sea, we know that the Lord divided between the people. So because it took days for the sea to actually part. It's not like you see in the movies where it parts instantly. It takes several days and then they cross, but the whole time God is interceding between them and the Egyptians so they can't get to him. So there's the timeline we see in like media, or I'm even going to say the History Channel, because man, history does not really begin to describe what they are anymore in a lot of ways. But you actually have to read the text rather than what you see in other modified versions that have artistic liberties. I'll put it that way. So when you look at it, they do plunder Egypt. They take a lot of this stuff from the Egyptians. It's actually mentioned multiple times. That's where they get a lot of their gold, their really nice items. And they did take it all with them. I mean, they took everything they had with them. Basically, imagine, I think of the modern equivalent is if we all got a bunch of U-Haul trucks and we just loaded up with everything we could find. You're going to have a lot of stuff in there. Those U-Haul trucks, they're pretty good these days. But they took everything. Nothing was left behind. So, yeah.
They loaded all this livestock with them.
Yeah, I mean, the livestock can travel on its own feet. It's not like they had to like pick it up and carry it with them physically. they had to lead it maybe, but they didn't have to physically carry it. So, yeah, we see this happen and these mentions of these things throughout the wanderings in the desert, that they have these things that they took from Egypt. It will sometimes even mention it was the things they got from Egypt. I think that's mentioned when they're making the golden calf. I can't remember for sure. I think it's mentioned some of the things they got from Egypt were used in that. So we see it periodically. In fact, when we talk about this offering here in Numbers chapter 7, I immediately think that the silver plate and the golden plate that he offers, they probably came from Egypt. There's no doubt to me about that. I doubt they were dabbling in metallurgy while they're wandering through the desert at that time. That wouldn't be something they would be doing. So yeah, there you go. Any other thoughts, comments? Go ahead, Arnold. Yeah. Well, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And the way I look at that, because I think the way it's phrased is your brothers will bow to you. When you see Nahshon, they're all the tribe of Judah. They're all the same son descendants. But then when you get to David and he's king over all of Israel, I think that's when you start to see that fulfillment begin to take place. Is this like a stepping stone to that? Maybe, perhaps. There is a little bit of, there's several generations even between Nahshon and David before we get there. But it's not that David is this kid who came from a nowhere family of absolutely nothing. He's got some ancestors who mean something in the tribe of not just the tribe of Judah, but in Israel. Amminadab is the father-in-law to the high priest Aaron. That's kind of an important position to have. His ancestor Nahshon was the leader of the tribe of Judah as they went through the wilderness. That's sort of a big deal. We could probably say more on some of those, but he's not a totally nothing person. I would say he comes from, we'd call it maybe middle class station. I don't know what to say about that, but he's not a random person. Nothing that God sets up is random, and I think as we're going through these generations, going through this lineage, we see that this is not random. Like, these people are appearing here, and they serve a role, and they serve a function, and oftentimes those functions and the symbols they represent are then mentioned in the New Testament, and they're saying this is what God was leading toward. Now we see its fulfillment. So that's why this kind of study is great, because we get to see the whole picture. They couldn't in their own time, obviously, but we get to see their time and way past their time, and we can look at the whole thing and say, hey, look at this. God had a plan every step of the way. Here's how it came to be. So I guess a benefit and an advantage for us in that regard. Any other things on Nahshon that we want to mention? Okay, I'm going to just briefly talk about Salmon, because there's literally nothing about him in the Bible. He is not spoken of really hardly at all in the Old Testament, aside from a couple mentions in a few lineages. One's given in Ruth chapter 4, and then one in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 11. That's it. That's literally all that's there about him. He's only spoken of as the son of Nahshon and the father of Boaz, and that's it. That is his only role in this whole lineage. I don't have anything else to say about him, because the Bible doesn't say anything else about him. So unless someone else has some knowledge I don't know of, I'm going to be done with Salmon. That one's an easy one. And that's what I thought like a lot of these would be. It'd be like Salmon, like, yeah, we don't know much about him. They're listed, and then we move on. He's actually the only one who I ran into this with. So when we get to and Salmon, of course, he's listed in the lineage in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 4 and 5, and Luke chapter 3, verse 32. The next one is Boaz, and we have only got a couple minutes, so I'm not going to get too deep into Boaz, but maybe I'll give some instructions about how we want to approach Boaz for next week, because I have a lot more to say about Boaz. He gets almost a whole book kind of about him and his role in the Bible, so I'm going to save him for next week because he's a much bigger topic. But I think he's a really good one to talk about. He is listed in the lineage in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, and Luke chapter 3, verse 32. And next week, because I'm not going to try to get into it this week because 3 minutes is not enough time to spend on Boaz. If you have time, and if you don't make time, go ahead and read through the book of Ruth, because next week I'm going to go through a lot of sections of the book of Ruth. And for the sake of time, I don't want to read every section. We'll read probably parts of it. But it's good to have a whole context of it. So Ruth is not very long. It's only like 4 chapters long. And it's an easy read. Boaz is a very interesting guy. And if I could say, he's kind of the model of what men should strive to be. He's kind. He's merciful. He's a hard worker. And he's always trying to do things the right way. There are moments where he could have done something and no one would have said anything about it, but he wanted to make sure he did it the right way, and I think that's very respectable. So I like Boaz. He's probably one of my favorites in the Bible. So we'll talk about him next week, and just kind of give you an overview of where we're at. After we get through Boaz, we have Obed, and then Jesse, and then David. So we're only a few generations away from the time of the kings. In fact, when we go and talk about Boaz in the book of Ruth, it says very specifically at the beginning of Ruth, during the time of the judges. So, we get Nahshon leading him through the wilderness, and then you have Salmon, and then by the time you get to Boaz, we're in the book of Judges, chronologically, if you will. And then, of course, by the time we get to David, we're during the reign of King Saul. So that gives you kind of where we're fitting in the timeline here of the scripture. That's kind of good for us to kind of, check to see where we're at. But we're going to stop there. Like I said, I'm not going to try to get Boaz now. But like I said, please read through the book of Ruth beforehand, and then we'll talk about Boaz. I think we'll have a lot of good conversation about Boaz. And then we'll also kind of double back to those couple of verses where Perez is mentioned in Ruth. I think there's an interesting callback there. So we'll do that when we go through and talk about Boaz. All right, that's all for this morning. Thank you very much.